My name is Albert Whitcombe. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 5 years of my life looking after my wife, who I believed was slowly being taken from me by a degenerative neurological condition. I want to tell you what happened 9 days ago, because I still cannot put the whole shape of it into words, and I think if I don't say it out loud to someone, anyone who will listen, it might swallow me whole. The morning everything came apart began the way every morning had begun for the better part of half a decade. My alarm went off at 5:40 in the morning. Not because I had anywhere to be. I retired from the engineering consultancy I'd worked at for 31 years, back when my wife first fell ill. The alarm went off because Margaret needed her first round of medication at 6 o'clock sharp. And in 5 years I had never once allowed that clock to slip past the mark. 5 years of mornings, and not a single one missed. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment. The way I always did. Just letting myself breathe. The house was still dark. We live in a small place on the Coromandel Peninsula, about 20 minutes inland from Whitcombe, on a piece of land that's been in my wife's family since her grandfather cleared it after the war. In the early morning, you can hear the creek that runs along our southern boundary, and you can hear the moorporks calling from the bush, and not much else. 5 years ago, that quiet used to soothe me. By the morning I'm telling you about, I had learned to keep my mind moving constantly, because stillness left too much room for grief. And grief at that hour of the morning is a heavy thing to carry alone. I put on my slippers, wrapped myself in the woolen dressing gown my daughter had sent down from Auckland the last Christmas. We'd all been together as a whole family, and walked down the hall to the room we'd converted into a medical space when Margaret had first come home from Waikato Hospital. Margaret was already awake. She often was. Before I got there, she'd be lying with her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling, which her specialist had told me was common with the kind of cognitive impairment she'd been diagnosed with. The stroke, they'd said, had been sudden and severe. It had affected the regions of the brain responsible for memory, language, and what the consultant called executive function. On her good days, Margaret could say my name and hold a short conversation before the fog rolled back over her. On her bad days, she looked at me as though I were a stranger who had wandered in off the road. "Good morning, love," I said. She blinked at me. Not the blinking of someone confused, just a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. I had learned over 5 years to read her eyes the way you learn to read the harbor, by watching it long enough to understand what every change in the surface means. I pulled the curtains open a few inches to let in the gray, early light coming up over the ranges, and then I went through the routine. Medications first. The 7-pill organizer her neurologist had prescribed, sorted every Sunday evening into their daily compartments. Then the morning wash, warm water, unscented soap, the same pale blue flannel I'd been using since I'd ordered a dozen of them online 2 years ago. Then I'd help her sit up, arrange her pillows behind her, and talk to her while I prepared her breakfast. I always talked to her. Even on the days when her eyes had nothing in them, I talked. I talked about the weather over the ranges. I talked about the sheep that had wandered across the boundary fence the previous afternoon. I talked about our daughter Eleanor, the way I always eventually talked about Eleanor, because not talking about her felt like agreeing she was really gone. That morning I made her oatmeal the way she'd always liked it, with a small spoonful of manuka honey and a few slices of feijoa from the tree by the back porch. I sat down beside her bed and fed her. Slowly. Patiently. I asked her if she remembered the trip we'd taken to the Bay of Islands the year before Eleanor was born. I asked her if she could hear the magpies starting up outside. She didn't answer. She rarely answered, but I'd long ago stopped expecting answers and started taking comfort in the act of asking. After breakfast, I helped her with her stretches. The physiotherapist had stopped coming to the house about 18 months back. Around the same time my daughter Eleanor had vanished, but I'd kept the routine going on my own. Then I settled Margaret into her chair by the window with the classical station playing softly on the radio. And I went through to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. That's when I noticed the bottle. It was sitting on the kitchen bench beside the kettle, small, amber-colored, the kind of generic prescription bottle you'd pick up from any chemist. But it wasn't one of Margaret's 7. I knew her medications the way I knew my own hands. I had filled and refilled those prescriptions for 5 years. This bottle had a label I had never seen before, partially torn away, as though someone had tried to peel it off in a hurry. The dosage information was gone. Only a partial batch number remained, and a few letters from what might have been a brand name, foreign-looking. Not one I recognized from any New Zealand pharmacy I'd ever been into. I stood there for a long time, just holding it. Then I walked back through to Margaret's room and knelt down beside her chair. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "did someone give you this?" She looked at the bottle. Her eyes went very still in the way they did when something was happening inside her that she couldn't get out. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand, the hand that had retained the most movement after the stroke, and she pointed toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the spare bedroom where my younger brother always slept when he came up to stay. My brother had stayed 2 nights ago. I called Margaret's neurologist before 9 o'clock. Her name was Dr. Hannah Pereira, and she was the 3rd specialist Margaret had been under since the original diagnosis. The first, a Dr. Lindsay Marston, had retired without much warning 2 years into Margaret's treatment. His replacement had moved across the ditch to a practice in Brisbane after less than a year. Hannah Pereira had taken over from there, and she was thorough and direct. Both qualities I had come to appreciate. "I found a medication I don't recognize," I told her. "I think someone might have been giving Margaret something outside of her prescribed regime." There was a careful silence on the other end of the line. "Bring her in today, Albert. I want to run a full panel. Bloods. The lot." I had Margaret dressed and in the car by 10. The drive down to the medical center in Hamilton took the better part of 2 hours, winding down through the Kaimai Range, and I talked to her the entire way. About the manuka coming into bloom along the road, about the color the bush was turning where the autumn was starting to bite. About Eleanor, the way I always eventually talked about Eleanor, because not talking about her had become unthinkable. My daughter had been 36 when she vanished. She'd been working remotely as a chartered accountant out of a little office she'd set up in the 2nd bedroom of her flat in Hamilton, coming up to see us 2 or 3 times a week to help me with Margaret. Then one day, in early March, 18 months ago, I'd received a text message from her phone saying she'd taken a position with a firm in Singapore and was leaving on a flight that evening. No phone call, no goodbye in person, no drive out to the property to say it to my face. Just a text, and then silence. The police had looked into it and found nothing they considered suspicious. She was an adult who had decided to move on with her life, they told me. "People do it all the time," they said. I never believed it. Not for a single day. Eleanor wouldn't have left without putting her arms around her mother. She wouldn't have left without standing in our gravel driveway and crying. Because that's who she was. A young woman who felt everything fully and never pretended otherwise. The Eleanor who'd sent that text message was not the daughter I had raised. But I had no proof, just a father's certainty, which doesn't count for much when you take it down to the police station. Dr. Pereira met us at the entrance of the medical center herself, which I appreciated. She had a gentle way with Margaret, speaking slowly and clearly, holding eye contact. She asked me to wait in the family lounge while her team ran the tests. And I sat there for almost 3 hours with a cold cup of coffee from the machine and a copy of the New Zealand Geographic I didn't read. When the door finally opened and Dr. Pereira walked in with a colleague I didn't recognize, a younger man with the serious expression of someone carrying information he wished he didn't have to deliver, my stomach dropped before either of them had said a single word. "Albert," she said, "we need to talk somewhere private." In a small consulting room with the door closed behind us, Dr. Pereira set a folder on the table between us, but she didn't open it. "The bottle you brought in this morning," she began. "We've identified the compound. It's a combination of benzodiazepine derivatives and a synthetic sedative that isn't commonly prescribed in this country. I've never seen it written up on a New Zealand chart in my career. It's not on Margaret's medical record. It has never been prescribed to her by any physician at this center, or at any center I can find a record of." "What is it doing to her?" I asked. "It's suppressing cognitive function," her colleague said quietly. "Specifically, the kind of high-dose, long-term administration we're seeing reflected in Margaret's blood work would produce symptoms very consistent with moderate to severe vascular dementia, confusion, memory gaps, emotional flatness, difficulty with language and motor coordination. It would mimic almost exactly what you've described to us about her presentation over the past 5 years." The room was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "Are you telling me," I said slowly, "that my wife doesn't have dementia?" Dr. Pereira looked at me with steady, careful eyes. "What I'm telling you, Albert, is that the neurological damage we attributed to her stroke 5 years ago is not consistent with what we're seeing on her scans today. Her current MRI shows far less structural impairment than her original imaging suggested, and the substances in her bloodstream are not consistent with natural disease progression. They are consistent with deliberate, sustained chemical sedation, administered over a period of years." I put both my hands flat on the table. I needed to feel something solid under my palms. "Someone has been poisoning her," the colleague said. "Not to kill her, to keep her incapacitated, Albert." Dr. Pereira said gently, "I need you to ring the police. Now, from this room." Those words hit me the way I imagine a serious accident hits a person. One moment, ordinary life. The next, the world is simply different, and there is no road back to the one you were on a minute ago. I sat in that consulting room with a detective named Riria Taiping for nearly 4 hours. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent a long career learning to listen without showing what she was thinking. And she asked every question twice, from 2 different angles, the way good detectives do. I told her everything from the start. The stroke 5 years ago. Margaret had collapsed at home while I was away in Tauranga visiting a client. My younger brother Jeffrey had been the one to find her. Jeffrey had rung the ambulance. Jeffrey had been at the hospital when I arrived, white-faced and shaking, holding Margaret's hand. Dr. Marston had delivered the diagnosis that night. Severe ischemic stroke. Significant and probably permanent cognitive impairment. I remembered the way the word permanent had landed in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "Tell me about your brother's relationship with your wife," Detective Taiping said. "They always got along," I said. Margaret thought he was funny. He made her laugh. There was never any conflict between them. Not in 30 years. "And the family property?" I paused. I had not been expecting that question. Margaret's father owned just over 400 hectares in the valley before he passed away 7 years ago. The land has been in her family since the 1890s. He left it jointly to Margaret and her younger sister Patricia, with a clause that it couldn't be sold without both signatures. As Margaret's husband, and as her legal welfare guardian, a status I'd applied for after she became incapacitated, I technically held her signing authority over the property. The detective looked at me steadily. "Are you aware that there's been a proposal in front of the regional council for the past 3 years to put a state highway extension through that valley?" I felt the floor shift slightly under my chair. I'd heard rumors. Nothing official. "The route was confirmed by the council 8 months ago, Mr. Whitcombe. The land assessments along that corridor have gone up substantially. Who would have known about that route before it became public knowledge? My brother is a commercial property valuer," I said. And I heard my own voice, as though it were coming from a long way off. He has contacts inside several regional councils. He would have known. He would have known months, maybe years before anyone else. Detective Tippenny wrote something down in her notebook. And your daughter's disappearance. 18 months ago. Tell me about that. Take your time. By the time I finished, the detective's notebook was half full. She stood up and put her card in my hand. I'm placing an officer outside your wife's room here at the hospital tonight, she said. I'd like you to go home with an unmarked escort, and I need you to behave as if absolutely nothing has changed. Don't ring your brother. Don't ring your sister-in-law. Don't tell a single person what we've discussed in this room today. If anyone asks how Margaret is, you say it was a routine checkup. Do you understand? What about my wife? Can I talk to her? Dr. Pereira has stopped all non-prescribed substances as of this morning. Depending on how quickly her system clears the compounds, she may begin to be more responsive within 24 to 48 hours. The detective looked at me with something close to compassion. Albert, whatever she tells you when she becomes lucid, I want you to be prepared for it to be very difficult to hear. I drove home with an unmarked car following at a distance, and I sat in the driveway of our house for a long time, just looking at the place I had lived in for 33 years. The same house where Margaret and I had raised Eleanor. The same house where I had spent 5 years believing my wife was vanishing piece by piece. Talking to her every morning because I refused to give up on the chance she could still hear me. Someone had taken those 5 years from me. On purpose, with their eyes wide open. I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table, and I did not sleep at all that night. My brother rang the next morning at 8, which was unusual for him. He typically rang in the evenings. How's Margaret? He asked. I heard you took her in to see Hannah yesterday. He had eyes inside that hospital. Or he had spoken to my sister-in-law. Either way, the easy normalcy of his voice made my jaw tighten so hard, I felt the muscle ache. Routine appointment, I said. She had a bit of a chest infection coming on. Nothing serious. You should have rung me. I would have driven you down. It was nothing, Jeffrey. I'm fine. There was a brief pause on the line. You sound knackered, mate. I'm always knackered, I said. He laughed the way he had always laughed, warm and easy. And I realized in that moment that I had heard that laugh 10,000 times in my life and never once doubted what was behind it. When we hung up, I went into the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists for a long time. And tried very hard not to be sick. Detective Taipin rang me at noon. She wanted me back at the medical center. When I arrived, Dr. Pereira met me in the corridor outside Margaret's room with an expression that told me something had shifted. She's been asking for you, the doctor said quietly. By name. Coherent sentences. Her processing is still slower than I'd like, and she'll tire fast. But she's substantially more responsive than she was 24 hours ago. I stood outside that door for a moment, with my hand resting on the frame. 5 years of one kind of marriage. Whatever was waiting for me on the other side of that door was something entirely different. Margaret was sitting up. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking before any of this had begun, and older. And there were lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But her eyes were clear, not the glazed, distant expression I had spent 5 years interpreting. Her eyes were fully present, and when she saw me, they filled with tears so quickly she didn't have time to blink them back. Albert, she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, but it was steady, and it was hers. I crossed the room and took her hand, and I could not find a single word to say. I just held it, and she held mine back, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 5 years break open. How long? I finally managed. She understood exactly what I was asking. 5 years, 2 months, 3 weeks. She knew it precisely. She had been counting. Margaret, I said. Why didn't you try to warn me? She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the tears were running freely down her cheeks, and she wasn't trying to stop them. At the start, I did try. You remember when I would get agitated? When I would try to speak and it would come out wrong? I was trying to tell you something was wrong, but your brother was always there. Or my sister. One of them was always there. And whenever I came too close to saying anything real, the dose would go up. The bottle I found on the bench, I said. How did that get there? I managed to hide some of the tablets, she said. Over the last few weeks, I'd been getting small windows of clarity when the levels in my blood dropped low enough between doses. I started holding the tablets under my tongue when they thought I'd swallowed them. I hid them in an old tin behind the flour in the pantry. I knew you didn't go in there. I was hoping you'd find them eventually. I found the ones on the bench, I said. Those were the overflow, she said. I'd run out of room in the tin. Detective Taiping stepped forward gently from her position near the window. Mrs. Whitcombe, can you tell us who was administering the medication and how this began? Margaret looked at the detective, then back at me, and steadied herself. There was no stroke, she said quietly. I was drugged at dinner. Jeffrey had come over for Sunday dinner, and Patricia had been there too. I remember feeling wrong within an hour of eating, dizzy and confused in a way that was nothing like any dizziness I'd ever had. I remember falling in the kitchen. I remember Jeffrey on the phone calling the ambulance, and then I was in hospital. And there was a doctor named Marston telling me I'd had a serious neurological event and that I needed to cooperate with my treatment if I wanted any chance of recovery. Cooperate, the detective said. He came to my room alone the second night, Margaret continued. He told me that if I didn't comply with what he called the treatment protocol, there would be consequences for Albert. He said Jeffrey had people who could make things very difficult for my husband. He said the simplest thing for everyone was for me to be a good patient, let the process do its work, and Albert would be safe. And you believed him? I said. It wasn't an accusation. I just needed to understand. She looked at me with those clear, exhausted eyes. They knew things, Albert. Where you went. When you left the property. Jeffrey would come in and tell me where you'd been the day before, what you'd had for lunch at the cafe in town, details that proved someone was watching you. I was terrified, so I did what they told me. I let the process do its work, and I lay there. For 5 years, listening to you. Talk to me every morning about the creek and the magpies and Eleanor, and I focused everything I had on listening clearly, because it was the only thing keeping me on this side of the dark. I thought about 5 years of mornings. 5 years of routine. She had heard every word. The land, Detective Taiping said. When did you understand what this was really about? About 2 years in, Margaret said. I overheard Jeffrey talking on the phone in the spare room. He didn't realize I was having one of my clearer windows. He was talking to someone about the highway assessment and how the land value would be different in 2 years when the route was confirmed. He said something about the timeline working in everyone's favor. Your sister, Patricia, was also involved? I asked. Margaret's face changed. Patricia was Jeffrey's idea. He recruited her early on. She'd always been awful with money. Debt. Bad decisions. A pokey habit she'd hidden from the family for years. He offered to clear her debts, and she said yes. She was the one who controlled my appointments. She was the one who made sure the doctor who replaced Marston never ran the specific blood tests that would have shown what was actually in my system. And she was the one who kept pushing you to put me into a rest home, because if you were in a facility, I'd have signed the land over to cover your care costs. I said slowly. The whole shape of it was finally arriving. They'd have had everything. Margaret nodded, and then the doctor at the rest home would say I'd taken a sudden turn. And within a year there'd be a quiet funeral, and by then the highway would be public, and the land would be worth 4 times what it was when this all started. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation. "I need to ask about Eleanor," I said. My voice didn't sound like my voice. Margaret closed her eyes. It took her a moment to open them again. "Our daughter started noticing things," she said. "She was sharp, Albert. She started questioning the medication labels. She started asking why my blood work was never comprehensive. She told me she was going to find out what was really happening to me. And then she disappeared," I said. "She didn't go to Singapore," Margaret said. "She found something. I don't know what. She confronted your brother about it. 3 days later, she was gone. And I had a visit from Jeffrey telling me my cooperation was no longer optional. He showed me a photograph. Eleanor, alive, but clearly frightened. I gripped the bedrail. Do you know where she is? He mentioned a place once, in a careless moment. A holiday cottage on the edge of the Mamaku Plateau. He and Russell used to go pig hunting up there in the autumns. Russell, I repeated. Russell Meade. My oldest friend. 42 years. We'd been at Massey University together, in the same hostel, in the same engineering intake. He'd driven up from Wellington when Margaret was first hospitalized and stayed 3 days, sleeping on our couch. He'd rung me every Sunday evening for the first year of Margaret's illness, just to ask how I was holding up. He'd brought me whiskey and watched the rugby with me, and told me he was proud of the way I was managing. Russell introduced Jeffrey to Dr. Marston, Margaret said quietly. They knew each other from the lodge in Wellington years ago. I don't know how deep his involvement goes, but he's connected. He's part of it. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, because my legs simply stopped working properly. 42 years, I said. To no one in particular. 42 years. Detective Tipine was already on her phone. The next several hours moved in a way that felt simultaneously very fast and impossibly slow. The detective informed me that arrest warrants were being prepared for my brother and my sister-in-law, and that a search warrant for the property on the Mamaku Plateau was being expedited based on Margaret's testimony about Eleanor. Russell's financial records were already being pulled by the fraud unit in Wellington. I want to come, I told the detective when she briefed me on the plan to approach the cottage. You're not a sworn officer, Mr. Whitcombe. She's my daughter. The detective looked at me for a long moment. You'll stay with the support team at the perimeter. You don't move until I give the word. Are we absolutely clear on that? It was nearly a 3-hour drive from the hospital to the Mamaku, and I rode in an unmarked vehicle with 2 plainclothes officers, while the tactical teams moved separately. The roads got narrower as we climbed up into the bush, and by the time we turned off onto the gravel track that led toward the old hunting cottage, the light was going amber and low through the kahikatea. We stopped about half a kilometer out. Through the trees I could see the corrugated iron roof and 2 vehicles parked outside. My brother's ute and a dark sedan I didn't recognize. The tactical team deployed without a word. I stood by our vehicle with a constable named Hemi Walker, who had the kind of steady presence that made you feel, irrationally, that things might be all right. What if she's not there? I said. He didn't answer, which was probably the most honest thing he could have said. The radio crackled. Movement inside. 2 adult subjects confirmed. Searching for additional occupants. Then a long silence that lasted maybe 90 seconds and felt like an hour. Then, 2 suspects in custody. 1 additional occupant located. Adult female. Conscious. Responsive. I was already moving before Constable Walker could step in front of me. He didn't try to stop me. The inside of the cottage was small and smelled like damp wood and kerosene from an old hurricane lamp on the table. My brother was on the floor with his hands being cuffed behind his back. His face was a color I had never seen on him before. Gray. Deflated. The face of a man whose entire plan has finally run out of road. He looked up at me as I went past, and he started to say something. I didn't stop to hear it. In the back room, a small space with a camp bed and a single window and a battery-powered lamp on an upturned crate, My daughter was sitting upright with a tactical officer crouching in front of her. She had lost a lot of weight. She had a bruise along her jaw that was old enough to have yellowed at the edges. She looked up when I came through the door, and for a half second, her face went completely blank with shock, and then it broke open. "Dad," she said. I crossed the room and held her, and I did not let go for a long time. She was shaking. I was shaking. The officers stepped quietly out of the room to give us a moment. "Mum," she kept saying. "Is Mum okay? Is she alive?" "She's alive," I said. "She's at the hospital in Hamilton. She's been talking, Eleanor. She's been talking in full sentences." Eleanor pulled back enough to look at my face. The tears were running down hers, and she didn't bother to wipe them. She looked exactly like the daughter I had raised, the one who felt everything fully and never pretended otherwise. "I found the prescription records," she said. "I found the billing codes that Dr. Marston had been using, and they didn't match any of Mum's documented diagnoses. When I confronted Uncle Jeffrey, You don't have to explain right now," I said. "He said he'd hurt you if I told anyone. He said he had people watching the house." "I know," I said. "It's over. It's all over now." Detective Taipeen appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just gave me a small nod, and I understood that everyone was accounted for. I learned the full scope of it in pieces over the days that followed. The way you always learn about a disaster, never all at once, always in increments that let you absorb one layer before the next one arrives. My brother had been the architect of the whole thing. He had discovered the preliminary highway route assessments through a contact in the Regional Council Planning Office nearly 2 years before any public announcement. He had run the numbers on what Margaret's land would be worth once the route was confirmed. Since the property was jointly held by Margaret and Patricia, he needed both of them cooperating. Patricia he bought with debt relief and the promise of a share. The problem had been me. As Margaret's husband, I had considerable legal standing over her affairs, and I was the kind of man who asked questions and read paperwork carefully. I would never have agreed to sell the land. So the plan was to remove Margaret from the equation entirely, make her legally incapacitated, make me her exhausted, overwhelmed caregiver, and then gradually push me into either signing over authority or agreeing to put her into a rest home where she would no longer be my legal responsibility in the same way. Dr. Marston had been recruited through Russell. The two of them had a history that Detective Taipeen described carefully as mutually compromising, which I understood to mean they had enough on each other to ensure cooperation. Marston had falsified the original diagnosis, established the medication protocol, then resigned and taken a position in a private clinic in Kuala Lumpur before anyone could scrutinize his records too closely. Interpol had picked him up in Malaysia 6 days after the cottage. He's currently fighting extradition. He won't win. Russell had managed the money. Portions of Margaret's medical trust, which her father had set up years earlier to provide for exactly this kind of situation, had been redirected through a shell company that Russell controlled, flowing into accounts that eventually funded my brother's operation, including the cost of keeping Eleanor detained on the plateau. When the detective told me about Russell, I asked her to give me a minute alone, and she did. I sat in the corridor of the medical center and looked at the linoleum floor and thought about 42 years. I thought about all the nights he'd sat with me in that very building, in other buildings, in my own living room. I thought about the phone calls, and the whiskey, and the rugby games. I thought about trust as a thing you build slowly over decades, and how it can be destroyed in the time it takes to read a single page of bank records. "He came up to visit you so often during Margaret's illness," the detective said, when she came back. "You were his alibi for being in the area. Every visit was an opportunity for him to check on the operation." I didn't say anything. "He's cooperating fully now," she added. "Names. Financial records. The lot. He says he didn't know about Eleanor until after she was already detained. and that he tried to get your brother to let her go. Does that matter? I asked. Legally, somewhat. Personally, that's your business, Mr. Whitcombe. She was right. It was my business. I haven't yet decided what to do with it. 2 weeks after the cottage, Margaret was moved to a rehabilitation unit in Hamilton for what the specialists estimated would be a 3 to 6 month recovery. The long-term sedation had left her physically weaker than her age would suggest, and there were cognitive aftereffects from the sustained chemical exposure that would need careful unwinding, but the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. She was sharp, she was determined, and she was furious in a quiet, focused way that I recognized as the particular fury of a woman who has been underestimated for a very long time. Eleanor came up from Hamilton. She was staying in the house with me while she recovered, and the two of them met for the first time since before Eleanor's disappearance. I stood in the doorway of Margaret's room and watched them hold each other. And I thought about all the mornings I had talked to my wife about our daughter while she lay there unable to answer, and how she had listened to every word. She knew, Eleanor told me afterwards. She said every single time you talked about me, she would focus everything she had on listening clearly. She said it was the only thing that kept her going some mornings. On the legal side, the case moved quickly once the cooperation started flowing. My brother was charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, fraud, and the unlawful administration of controlled substances. Patricia took a plea arrangement in exchange for her full account of the operation. Russell faced fraud and conspiracy charges on top of being named as a co-conspirator in the kidnapping. The shell company's financial records turned out to contain entries that implicated a regional council planning officer and a roading contract manager who had been steering the highway assessments for private benefit. Detective Tipini told me it was the largest corruption case to come out of the Waikato in a generation. The land is still ours. It will stay ours. About 3 weeks after the cottage, I drove out to Margaret's family property in the valley. Alone. I parked at the gate, the way Margaret and I used to park when we'd walk the boundary fence together in the evenings. Before everything, the grass was long, and the light was going gold over the ridge, and the creek that runs along the southern edge was moving quietly over the stones, the way it always has. I stood there for a long time, thinking about what 5 years costs a person. Not just the hours and the sleep and the grief of believing you're watching someone you love disappear. I mean the other cost. The cost of trusting people completely and being completely wrong. I'm 64 years old, and I thought I had a clear understanding of which people in my life were solid and which ones weren't. I thought I had that map memorized. 5 years ago, somebody redrew it without telling me, and I walked around carrying the wrong map the whole way. I don't know what to do with that, except to tell you about it. Margaret came home 4 months after the cottage. She walked through the front door with a stick in one hand and Eleanor on her other side, and she stood in the hallway and looked at the place the way you look at something you weren't sure you were ever going to see again. Then she walked through to the kitchen and sat at the table and asked me to make her a cup of tea, and I did. We talked for 3 hours that first afternoon. About the 5 years. About the things I'd said to her while she lay there, that she'd held on to. About the things I'd missed. Her voice, her opinions, the particular way she argued when she thought she was right about something, which was most of the time. There was pain in that conversation that I don't think either of us will ever fully put down. You don't go through something like this and come out the other side unscathed. That would be a comfortable lie. And I'm too old for comfortable lies. But here's what I can tell you honestly. 2 months ago, I sat on the front porch in the early evening, and Margaret came and sat next to me. And we didn't say anything for a long time. Just listened to the creek and the moorporks. And she put her hand over mine the way she used to before any of this began, and I thought, this is still real. Whatever they did to us, this part is still real. Eleanor stayed through the autumn and into the winter. She's decided to stay closer to home permanently now. She's opened her own small accounting practice in Whitcombe, and she comes for dinner twice a week. She still flinches at unexpected sounds sometimes. And I see Margaret watch her when that happens with the particular grief of a mother who knows she couldn't protect her child and can't quite stop apologizing for it. We're working through it. That's all I can tell you. One day at a time, which sounds like a cliché until you understand that some days the only honest unit of measurement you have left is a single day, and you take it. My brother is awaiting trial in a remand facility in Hamilton. Patricia is serving her sentence under the plea arrangement. Russell, I haven't spoken to. I don't know if I ever will. The 42 years are not something I can simply subtract from my life, but I also can't pretend they meant what I once thought they meant. That's a kind of arithmetic I'm still learning. Slowly. The way you learn anything difficult. By sitting with it. If there's anything I want you to take away from what I've told you tonight, it's a few things I've turned over in my mind during the long evenings since this all came apart. The first is to trust your instincts. When something feels wrong about a person you love, even when every voice around you is telling you it's nothing, even when the people telling you that are family, sit with that feeling. Don't push it away. The body knows things long before the mind catches up. Margaret tried to tell me. I didn't read her properly. Eleanor saw it. I didn't listen quickly enough. Your gut is rarely wrong. Honor it. The second is to be careful about what you sign and what you don't read. Take the extra hour. Take the extra day. Have a solicitor look at it, who isn't connected to anyone in your family, especially when there's land or money involved. Greed is one of the oldest motives in the world, and it doesn't care how long it's been since you taught your younger brother how to ride a bike, or how many Christmases you've spent at the same table. The third is this. If you are caring for someone who can't speak for themselves right now, whether through illness, injury, age, or anything else, please keep talking to them. Please, tell them about the weather. Tell them about the garden. Tell them about the people you both love. They can hear more than you know. The voice of someone who loves you is one of the most powerful things in this world. It can hold a person in the light when nothing else can reach them. I learned that the hardest possible way. Don't wait to learn it the way I did. And the fourth, the one I keep coming back to in the small hours of the morning. Sometimes the only act of resistance available to you is just to stay. To keep showing up, to keep talking even when no one seems to be listening. Someone might be listening. Someone you love might be holding on to the sound of your voice, the way a person in deep water holds on to a piece of wood. If I had given up, if I had listened to my brother or to Patricia and signed the papers and put Margaret into a rest home, I don't want to think about what would have happened to my wife or to my daughter. I don't have to think about it. Because I didn't give up. That's the one thing in this whole story I can hold on to. Cleanly. I didn't give up. Whatever you're carrying tonight, whatever long and exhausting and heartbreaking situation you're walking through, I'm asking you to hold on to that same thing. Just stay. Just keep talking. Just keep showing up tomorrow morning, the way you did this morning. Sometimes that's the whole job. Sometimes that's enough. If this story moved you, if something in it stayed with you, please leave a comment below and tell me where in New Zealand you're listening from. I read every one. Subscribe to New Zealand Tales for more testimonies like this one. And tap that like button if you believe that some things and some people are worth every last difficult day of fighting for. Kia kaha. Stay strong out there. Whoever you are, whatever you're carrying. I'll see you in the next one.